It's great to see so many of you here this afternoon. I'm Rajesh Merchandani, the Vice President for Communications and Policy Outreach here at the Centre for Global Development. And what a busy week this is for everyone. So thank you all for turning up for what's going to be a really, really interesting afternoon. An afternoon here at CGD because we have two events back to back. At 4:30 this afternoon, we're going to be launching a major new report called Payouts for Perils, how insurance can radically improve emergency aid. It's about how we can do better for people who have survived natural disasters right in the aftermath of them. It's on our website already at cgdev.org. I encourage you to go and check it out. For those of you who are in the room, there'll also be refreshments in between the two events to encourage you, or as economists like to say, incentivize you to stay. Right now, as you can see as they're taking their seats, we have an amazing panel for you to discuss a hot topic, the focus of much research, including here at CGD, and it'll be the focus of the next World Development Report as well. That's global education, specifically financing for learning. And by that, we don't just mean enrollment, we mean kids actually learning in schools in developing countries. As I said, if I could ask you to silence your phones, that would be great. In a moment, I will turn it over to our moderator. Just first, a couple of notes. There will be plenty of time for audience questions in the room and also online. Welcome to everyone who's watching via the live stream. If you are doing so, if you're watching remotely, you can leave us a question in the comment space at the bottom of the live stream page or on our YouTube page as well. Please do, we'd encourage it. We'll be monitoring. We'd love to include some of those questions. Similarly for Twitter, you can ask us a question by Twitter. We will be tweeting the event live. We encourage you all in the room to do so. Please use the hashtag CGDTalks. It's on the screens behind everybody, and our handle is @CGDev. At the end of the event, we will ask you to stay seated while our panelists leave the stage, and then we'll invite you for some refreshments. So with that, let me hand it over to our moderator, Amanda Glassman, who is the Chief Operating Officer and a Senior Fellow here at CGD. Amanda, thank you.
Thank you. Well, welcome. We're so pleased to host a very distinguished panel today on a topic whose moment has arrived on the global stage, education. We're joined by His Excellency, Dr. Jakaya Kikwete, the former President of Tanzania, Julia Gillard, the Chief of the Global Partnership for Education and the former Prime Minister of Australia, Anthony Lake, the Executive Director of UNICEF, and Gordon Brown, the Chair of the Education Commission and former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. Welcome. So a few words before we start. Better jobs, wages, economies, health, women's status, quality schooling has the potential to drive all of those development outcomes around the world. But as one of my colleagues puts it, schooling ain't learning. And every organization represented on our panel today has described a profound learning crisis across the developing world. Work by the Center and other researchers shows that education systems in many developing countries have trouble converting money into better learning outcomes. The Education Commission recently estimated that less than 10% of young people in poor countries are on track to acquire basic secondary level skills, reading, writing, math, if current trends continue unchanged. And the World Bank's forthcoming World Development Report on education says it succinctly. Greater public spending is not highly correlated with student learning outcomes. And in a recent paper, Yamini Iyer and Lant Pritchett here at the center show how India tripled per capita spending on education, but learning outcomes have fallen. This is incredibly disappointing. So today we're talking about education financing at CGD, but as a means to an end, and the end is to improve learning. So I'm hoping that this panel will help us understand how existing and new education money will be used to create real change, an impact on learning, or policy reforms that move us decisively down the road, and how these three main supporters, the Global Partnership for Education, the Education Commission, Education Cannot Wait, hosted at UNICEF, will work towards that goal together. Each will put forward their activities, their proposals, the discussion, and we've invited them to make the case for financing by making the case for learning. And we know that it takes much more than money. We all know that. Focused effort, stronger measurement and accountability for learning itself, innovation and testing to find out what works to change learning outcomes, attention to the incentives that shape the actions of ministries, headmasters, teachers and their unions, students and their families. All of this is needed to move towards genuine progress, and the politics are hard. So let's turn to our panel to hear how we'll get this done. Your Excellency, as president, you championed education, and huge amounts have been spent to raise enrollment rates. And despite this, children are not doing as well as they should be. What do you think needs to change to close the gap?
More money, but children are not doing as much as they should. Well, of course, I'm a member of the commission, and Prime Minister Gordon Brown is our chair. We spend a lot of time studying the state of education in the world. And the conclusions was that the world is facing an alarming education crisis. Mm-hmm. More pronounced in the low and middle income countries. They are 70 years behind the high income countries, so they have a huge catching up game. Many children are out of school. Estimates is 263 million, 100 million in Africa, 63 million in crisis situations where are created the education cannot wait, where Tony Lake is hosting. Those in school are not completing their education. Many. It's only 67% of primary school students in low-income countries actually completing their studies. So 33 are not. Those who are in school are not learning enough. Only half primary school, slightly more than a quarter in secondary school. And the learning also is a problem even in higher education. I think last week we were in Harvard University discussing how to revitalize higher education in Africa. That's one of the fears, that also in university, students are not, young people are not learning enough. So we looked at what needs to be done. Of course, there is need for reform. We factored the reforms. Reform on performance, reform innovation, reform inclusion, and of course increase more resources. And the point you raised is actually one of these things that came out in the commission. It's a question of how you manage the education system. Where the education system is managed well, the money that is spent is translated into learning. There was an example given of Tunisia and Vietnam. Mm-hmm. They're both spending the same amount of money per capita on students. The learning outcomes in secondary school in Tunisia is 64%. In Vietnam is 96%. So it's a question of how efficient this money is used. And in the commission, we discussed a number of things on how to deal with how to cut waste, so on, inefficiencies and so on. But all in all, we propose a compact between the international community and the developing countries. The developing countries commit to undertake reforms, transform their education systems, increase financing for education, and the international community undertakes to assist, to support them, because we are talking of countries that are poor. Even those who are called middle-income countries, some of them, it's a question of numbers, but in actual fact, the cake that remains is very small. Definitely, these countries need support. So in the commission, of course, we looked at what the kind of support exists today. ODA for education is declining. In 2002, it was 13%. Today, it is 10%, while the numbers of children are ever rising. So our form of recommendation has been, let us stem this decline, increase ODA to 15%. But we said, even if ODA is increased, there won't still be enough money for education because the demand is huge. So we agreed to look at innovative ways of raising resources. That's where one of the proposal there has been international finance facility for education, where essentially the proposal is, well, one is guarantee multilateral development banks so that they can leverage money in the financial market. Two, give grants so that MDBs can lend money at a lower cost, so that the middle-income countries will be able to borrow, because the low-income countries are under IDA, and IDA has been very well replenished. The issue is that replenishment, how much of that is going to be allocated for education? That's the question with IDA. Of course, there are other innovative ways. We have GPE.
They're up next.
Yes. We have GPE. It's done a fantastic job of supporting education in our countries. Tanzania is one of those recipients of that. They are now in the replenishment round. We have to support them. If they get more money, definitely that is essential. But she's from GPE. She can speak for herself.
Excellent. I think that's an excellent segue. So, Julia Gillard, today you're unveiling GPE's investment case. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I can hold it up for you. We are releasing it into the wild today, so you can all have your own copy, and please study it, take it home, and then make sure that you talk to everybody about it. It really builds on what the President has just said. He said that for children to learn, a system has to be properly managed, a schooling system. And at the Global Partnership for Education, we absolutely agree with that. And systems are only going to be well managed and get children learning if they are well planned and they are properly resourced. And so at the Global Partnership for Education, we work with developing countries to make sure that schooling is properly and inclusively planned. And then we mobilise money to support implementing those plans in low-income countries and some very at-risk lower middle-income countries. We've got a proud track record of using that model for change. It's a model that also incentivises, to use your economist's word, increased domestic resource mobilisation, because large grants are made available when countries are increasing their own domestic resources. And it's a performance-based model where there is a great deal of focus on quality and learning and equity and data, and indeed some of the money is at risk if those things aren't performed, if we don't hit those benchmarks. But I do want to just take up the sort of flavour that it's all about efficiency. Efficiency of the spend is incredibly important. But Gordon leaned over to me during your talking about efficiency and said, yes, and we need more money too. And it's absolutely that. We need more money and we need greater efficiency in the spend. When we look around the world, the access challenge is not solved. 260 million children who are not in school. And then the quality challenge is a profound one, with kids in school but not learning. So the question becomes, what are we going to do about it? A practical agenda for change is our case for replenishment. We are asking the international community, so nation states and private philanthropic donors, to replenish GPE at the rate of $3.1 billion. That's our replenishment for 2018, 19 and 20. We then want to achieve the Education Commission benchmark of $2 billion per year, moving to $4 billion per year in 2030. And that money will be mobilised so that more children complete primary school, more children complete secondary school, there are more trained teachers, they are acquitting learning outcomes, there are textbooks and other material. And this spells out that our aim for this replenishment period is 19 million more children completing primary school, 6.6 million more children in secondary school, plus more trained teachers, more learning materials available. If we can't do that, if we can't keep that journey of change not only in train but actually accelerating, all of the statistics that you will hear quoted today will be on a downward path, not an upward path. So a successful mobilisation for GPE is pivotal at this time. Time is short. We are looking to replenish our funds either at the end of this year or very early next year, and we all know how the months gallop by, so that is not very long away. Great many of the people in the audience are great friends and colleagues of GPE. Thank you for that, and we will be calling on you to mobilise again. Of course, there's more than GPE at work in education. Education Cannot Wait, such an important new initiative for education in crisis situations, and Tony's going to speak about that. And the International Financing Facility for Education, an innovative approach to unlock funds that currently aren't available for education at all, and Gordon will speak about that. We think of these things as three legs of a stool. I'm looking for a more glamorous metaphor, but Tony likes the three legs of the stool, so a plain old stool will have to be. I'm blaming it on Tony. But it does mean that these things can come together and work together to give us the lift that we need to see in education. But in some ways, we're the sort of first cab. Education Cannot Wait is continuously fundraising as it should for a new initiative, but we're the sort of first cab off the rank in the sense that we will be testing in the coming months the generosity of the international community. We're not naive about the nature of the political environment, but we do want to break through so we can achieve results at this kind of scale.
Okay, thank you. So tell us a little bit about Education Cannot Wait and how it fits with the rest of UNICEF's work.
Great. Actually, if I could clarify, well, first let me say I'm really excited to be here. And the test of that is that my beloved Boston Red Sox are on a television screen at a block away, and I'm still here. So, and that was not necessarily going to be the case.
Thank you.
So,
thank you.
Yes. And let me also say how important all three legs of the stool, if you want to use that image, are. And with the three parts legged stool, if you take one away, then the stool flips over. So I certainly, from UNICEF, although we don't have a big checkbook, are enthusiastically supporting GPE replenishment and the new financing facility. I'd like to make an argument, if I could, for not just the quality of education and learning, but who is learning. Because we have both, I believe, a moral and an important strategic imperative in concentrating our education, including public and international financing, on the most disadvantaged and the poorest children. And it's simply a common sense proposition, because if you are not putting more education into the poorest children now, in another generation, we will simply replicate the same poverty, the same intergenerational cycles of inequalities in societies that are so bedeviling us today. So let's do that. There is one obscene statistic, which is that something like 46% of the public financing in LDCs goes to the 10% of children who are getting the most education. And that's just going to replicate the poverty and all the problems we're seeing in the next generation. At UNICEF, we keep bringing in health, we keep bringing in water, all of those things into the poor areas. If there is not education in those areas, we're going to be doing it a generation from now. So that's point one. Point two is, who are the children who are in the most dire circumstances? Not just with poverty, but in dire circumstances, and that is obviously the 1 out of every 4 children in the world who are living in a conflict or crisis situation, 1 out of every 4. So thanks in large part to Gordon's leadership, last May at the World Humanitarian Summit, we launched the Education Cannot Wait initiative. And let me emphasize, UNICEF is hosting it, but UNICEF is not running it. It's an independent board, and there's a clear firewall between UNICEF's work and the work of the fund. It started last May. It is focusing on bringing education to the children in conflicts. I'll come back to why, But education cannot wait has a particular meaning because on average, a conflict or crisis situation now lasts 17 to 20 years. So we should not be in the grip of the myth that if we simply wait for it to get better and then we can start doing education, we can fix everything, because we can't. We have to be doing it now. The fund has already raised over $100 million, thanks to the generous support of a number of governments and foundations. It was founded by both governments and such as Norway, I see here, and NGOs such as Save the Children and others, and it's been very much a communal effort. That over $100 million now, we're already starting to work in 4 countries to reach some 2 million kids with education. And a part of the role of the fund will be to fund things. But the other part is to try to bring together at the country level as well as the global level the folks who are doing development and the folks who are doing humanitarian relief. And if I could have 1 minute just to explain, that is such an artificial distinction. And we have to break down those boxes, and the fund is working on doing it at both, as I said, the country and the global level. If you ask a child in South Sudan, are you in a humanitarian context or a development context, the child is going to say, wait a minute, I just want education. And all of you in this room know that when you go and talk to children, they almost number one on their list is education. So we have to break down those boxes. And if I may, I was just in Iraq, and a couple of specific things really struck me. In Fallujah, I noticed first that it was only the schools that had been bombed in the fighting 6 months ago because they were being used as command posts by ISIS. Then everybody was working to bring the people back into Fallujah, and the parents were saying, no, we're not going to go back. We're not going to leave the camp until we know that our kids can be educated. That's it, not food, not anything else, education. And I was in Mosul, eastern Mosul, and I met with at a camp with the camp manager, who said that he had seen some boys make a doll out of mud and then cut the head off the doll. And he said, why did you do that? And they said, to show that we're going to be men someday. And I met a grandfather in the eastern Mosul, just across the river from where the fighting was, and he had just been liberated, and he said for 2 years he had kept his grandchildren in his home so that he could educate them himself, and showed me the books that he had been using, etc. My point is that if those kids are not both healed in their hearts and educated in their minds, then the future of Iraq is very much in doubt, because we will simply replicate in the next generation the same conflicts and the same ignorance and hatred that we've seen in this.
Yeah,
And Education Cannot Wait is working on it.
Powerful story, thank you. So Gordon Brown, you've noted that current investment levels don't get us to the sustainable development goal of education. We've heard some proposals on how to accomplish that. What do you suggest? How do we go forward?
Well, let me say, first of all, it's a real pleasure to be at the Center for Global Development, and I want to thank you for the innovative work that all of you do. And I see so many people who are very involved in education, and I want to thank you also for the contribution you make and the service you give and the difference that you are making. And I want to start where Tony finished. I too have been in South Sudan, and I just give you one example. I went to a village outside Juba, and I met a group of mothers who were on a project that was funded actually by the World Bank. They had probably, almost all of them, been married at the age of 13, 14, or 15. They had problems about food, they had problems about shelter, they had problems about their very safety, but what they wanted was education for their children. And it was fascinating to hear them talk about how they saw the future. And then I went up to the school, and it was just a prefabricated hut. And they could only take 20 kids in that school. And what I remember from that visit is the portals where I could look out on kids outside, 100 kids outside looking in at the 20, who were the only 20 who get the benefit of education. I talked to a mother who had to choose between one of her twins, which one would get education. And then if you look at the statistics for South Sudan, 400 girls only in senior secondary education throughout the whole of the country when there should be 100,000. So a ratio of 1 for every 250 that should be in education. And that is the crisis that we're facing. 260 million not in school, 400 million who leave without anything approaching primary level qualifications in literacy and numeracy, 800 million who don't have the qualifications necessary when they leave for the workforce of tomorrow. And the figures that we proved was that by 2030, there would be 850 million children in that position without the requisite skills if we did not take some remedial action now. And yes, the start of our commission was reform and modernization required of the education systems in the poorest countries of the world, where too little attention is given to the quality of teaching, the training of teachers, the curriculum itself, the use of technology, discipline and standards in the schools. And President Kikwete should be praised because his big results now has been one of the success stories in Africa, and that's why he's going around the rest of Africa for the Commission, imploring these countries to look at the results that bring better quality. And yes, the countries themselves have got to spend more. So if Nigeria spends 2% of its national income on education, Pakistan 2%, then it's not surprising between these two countries there are 20 million children who are not at school. So you've got to raise spending, domestic mobilization, from 4 to 5.8% of GDP according to our findings. But even then, and even if we raise aid levels so that education goes from 10 to 15% of aid, and if aid itself goes up, which of course is a huge issue now because of the countries that are lowering aid, then we still have this huge financing gap. If ever we are to meet the Millennium or Sustainable Development Goals now by 2030, then there is a financing gap even after all these things happen of around 100 billion. And we cannot do the changes that we need and get the reforms we want without looking also at innovative sources of finance. So my message today is, yes, we must support the GPE in their replenishment, and they're announcing today what they need for the future, and I want to thank them for the work that they do. And yes, we must find private as well as public donors to support Tony and what he has said on education cannot wait, because there are 30 million children who are displaced children around the world at the moment. But we must also think boldly and positively about the future, and that's why I come to the International Finance Facility for Education. As President Kikwete said, it is a mechanism by which countries will give guarantees, donor countries, allowing the regional development banks and the World Bank to borrow money for education, and then to convert the education loans effectively into credits, or in some cases into grants. Allows us, by this innovative method that I was involved in earlier with IFFEd in health, it's part of the climate change agenda, it's part of the debt relief agenda we did, to convert this money into education funding that would deliver a huge increase in aid over the next few years to enable us to have a chance of meeting the Sustainable Development Goals, not to leave them to be met a century from now, as the present trends suggest. And I want to suggest one thing in ending about where we can try and find a consensus. Everybody knows that in the last few weeks, the use of chemical weapons in Syria has been an absolute scandal which has united the world community. And when President Trump and country after country said that moral lines are being crossed, what they are meaning is not just in the use of chemical weapons, bad as that is, but in the militarization of schools, in the use of child militias, in the abduction of girls, in the sexual exploitation of girls, in the denial of the right to millions of people to education. There is a chance, in my view, to build a consensus across the political spectrum for action in defense of child's rights. This is the civil rights struggle of our time, that every single child should have the opportunity to develop their potential and bridge the gap between what they are and what they have it to become. Now, I'm not expecting, as a result of my speech, President Trump is going to tweet a message in support in the next few minutes.
It could
But I do believe, and I'm just going to finish there, I do believe if we can unite around an agenda that has been totally neglected for too many years, an agenda where finance and reform can go together, where there is now a viable program for the different organizations, 3 legs of the stool, actually 4 speakers, but 3 legs of the stool, then we can actually make a difference. And I would urge everyone in this audience to see it as part of their mission, to persuade the governments and the agencies that they should take this agenda for education
You are the
seriously,
legs.
because it delivers
I'm the feet.
SDG 1 and 2 as well by the reduction of poverty, SDG 3 by infant mortality and maternal mortality and how it's cut by better education, delivers Agenda 5 on gender equality, Agenda 8 on employment, and Agenda 10 on general equality. It unlocks so many of the Sustainable Development Goals that the reform and finance agenda that we're proposing, I hope you can widely embrace it and make it part of the mission of the next few years.
Can you tell us a little bit about what bilateral funders or other philanthropic funders are moving ahead with some of these ideas? What's the progress so far, and what are
on
the
the finance
obstacles?
facility?
On the finance facility,
Yeah,
on the
yeah.
GPE replenishment, where are we?
Well, just on the finance facility, and Julia will be able to say that she has got a large number of countries that are committed to GPE, and I hope they will continue to be committed, but not only raise the commitment, and we can find new donors as well. But our proposal on the finance facility has got the support of the World Bank and the regional development banks who would help administer it. We have been talking to potential donors who are asked initially to provide guarantees, which is not the same as public spending, as you know, because it's an innovative way of financing things. And President Kikwete has been around Africa, and to his great credit, with the access he has to presidents and prime ministers, he's built up considerable support, so that I have got letters from most of the presidents and prime ministers that he's visited, and we're also doing a huge amount of work in Asia. So it is a complementary architecture. The GPE, which specializes, of course, in the work they do in low-income countries with their grant funding. Education Cannot Wait with its initiative for displaced and refugee children, and then a finance facility whose purpose really is to mobilize resources for lower middle income countries. That's 700 million of the children who need help with the guarantees that we give. So we have support for this, but what we need, of course, is the political push from people who are here to make these things happen, and they are complementary. They work side by side and can make a huge difference.
Julia, do you want to?
I was joking with Gordon that if he has affected President Trump's attitude, we'll know via Twitter at 3 a.m. We won't know in the next 5 minutes, so let's watch that tomorrow morning. On our supporters, and so many of them are in the room, we have more than 20 nations that fund GPE, and we are diversifying the way in which we receive funding and getting increasing support from private philanthropic organisations. And in part that's because we have not only got our major grants process, but we have kicked off something we call the Knowledge and Innovation Exchange. So it really is recognising that if we're going to make every dollar count, if we're going to make sure that systems are properly planned and achieving, then we do have to mobilise knowledge and innovation in systems planning and systems delivery. Now, our developing country partners do a lot of that themselves, and Minister Managat is here, who heads our governance committee. We bring our developing country partners together regularly, and whilst they do talk about our board agenda, they spend a lot of the time talking about how they can best learn from each other. We've wanted to systematise that, so we've got major projects in assessment for learning, in early childhood development that are being very generously supported by philanthropic agencies. Dubai Cares is here as one of our great friends, to take one example. So we want to go back to our long-term nation-state donors and friends and say, you've been good partners, now stump up for some more. So we'll be very much lobbying and pushing on those doors. We will be very much talking to private philanthropics in the private sector, but we are also seeking to expand from the traditional donor base, and so having a set of conversations around the world very broadly to ensure that we can mobilise as much resource-wise as possible. And, you know, this is a campaign that has to happen at every level. Yes, there is intersection and advocacy with people who work in aid agencies, people who head aid agencies, with ministers for development, with prime ministers and presidents. But this is also a campaign in which changing hearts and minds in communities can put political pressure on leaders to act. And I'd like to shout out here to Global Citizen, which is here, which is one of our great supporters and friends capable of mobilising 10 million young people around the world. And in partnership with Global Citizen, we work with Rihanna as our global ambassador. I went with her to a school in Malawi, a secondary school. I was under no illusions. The girls were screaming because she was there, not because I was there.
It was you.
No, it most assuredly wasn't me. But it says something about the power of globalisation, that you can be in a secondary school in Malawi and they know who Rihanna is and they start singing her songs back to her. But having had that experience, she is very focused on our replenishment campaign and the advocacy for change for those children which she saw in Malawi and that we represent through our developing country partners around the world.
And President Kikwete, could you tell us a little bit about how domestic revenues combine with GPE or IFFEd or Education Cannot Wait funding to leverage reforms? Can you give us a couple of examples of how that might work well?
Well, of course, currently, countries are depending on their own resources to educate their children. Even when you look at the projections in the Commission, currently the world is spending 1.2 billion on education, and the proposal is to get that to 1.2 trillion. The proposal is to get that to 3 trillion by 2030. But of that 3 trillion, 2.7 is going to come from the countries. Only 0.3 is going to come from the international community. So essentially, we should have no illusions that actually it is the countries that are financing the education, the bulk, they're doing the heavy lifting on the education of their children. International community is there to give some support, but a critical support, particularly to those countries that without that support, they may not be able to do enough. That's an important factor to appreciate. We should not come out with an illusion that these countries are depending on donors for the education, predominantly on donors for the education of their children. No, that's not the case. So if that is the case, then essentially it is this money that has actually been responsible for the development that we have seen. I visited the 14 African countries. In all these countries, the education budget is the number one budget. Some countries are 20%, Ghana is 30%, Cote d'Ivoire is 30% of the budget. But we are talking of 20% of a small cake. It is not capable of meeting the demand. That is where the support, and because it's a small cake, they have to proportion this for education, for health, for roads, for water and sanitation and so forth. So the 20% that is being spent is little. That's why we think we need a lot more support from the international community. But we should say compliments what has happened. Actually, I was about 10 days ago, I was at Harvard talking about revitalizing higher education in Africa. I gave them an example of Tanzania. At independence, we only had 2 engineers. Now we have 18,000. And we were under German colonial rule from 1884 to 1918. And then the British inherited, not you.
I'm not that old. I'm black. I do take responsibility.
I'm not blaming you. From 1918 to 1961. And they left us with 2 engineers. They built a school for sons of chiefs. They built a school to get clerks. They built 3 trade schools to get artisans for mechanics, electricians, and masons. And they left the education in the hands of the faith-based organizations. So it's only after independence that we seriously invested in the education of our people. So we have started from that level. But from there up to from 2 engineers now to 18,000 engineers, it's really incredible. So a lot of our countries are spending a lot of money on the education of their people. Only that is not enough. That's where we pitch for more support.
Okay, I'm going to come back to you on this efficiency question, though, how to get more from that money. But tell us a little bit about your donors to Education Cannot Wait, and also how would you envision the three legs of the stool working together in a particular country context? How would that work, do you think?
I'll
How
make some
is it
very
working?
brief points. And if I look distracted because I can't get out of my mind the image of Julia playing rhythm guitar behind Rihanna while she's singing, but maybe you can send me a tape. Just a couple of points. One is, besides our advocacy for more public financing by governments and more support to governments as they do it, again, the question is where they are spending it. And just a plea that we advocate for their spending it more in the most disadvantaged areas for the sake of the next generation and eradicating poverty. The donations have come happily from governments, but also from private sources like Dubai Cares, and we could not have gotten it going without Dubai Cares. And we're hoping to achieve donations from all of the above. But let me emphasize, this could begin to sound as if the three of us are almost competing for the different pieces, and they really do fit together. And from a UNICEF perspective, I don't care where it goes because it is all going ultimately to the children who need to be educated. So all three. How are they working together? Well, at the global level, for example, supporting a group that are working from UNHCR, which is a little bit out of the coordination picture, UN agencies, various groups, to put together the global cluster of humanitarian agencies working to put together common frameworks, common practices, common ways of measuring so that we are more on the same page globally. And then in the field, for example, GPE and Education Cannot Wait are working in Chad, where Education Cannot Wait. It will be supporting, doing joint proposals, where Education Cannot Wait will be working on the displaced kids, and GPE will be working on building better education systems for the future, a perfect marriage of the humanitarian and the development. In Syria, Education Cannot Wait is supporting a forum of humanitarian education partners to work together to make sure that we have or can encourage the same standards and ways of operating in the various areas controlled by different groups, et cetera, et cetera. So it's global and it is local. And I think there are occasional differences among all of us, and we work them out very quickly. And so far, it's really been the stool is not even teetering.
The stool is stable. Okay.
And that's the last reference to a stool.
I like the stool. I'm going to stay with the stool. We'll turn to the audience in a second, so prepare your questions. But my last question is, since education reform can be so hard, politically challenging, how will more money help with this? Can you give us a couple of examples on how additional resources, the replenishment, the IFFEd is going to really move that reform agenda forward? And maybe I'll start with you, Gordon.
Yeah, I think President Kikwete should have taken advice in Tanzania from the Americans. They got rid of the British Empire in the 1770s, so they got out pretty quickly. The issue of reform is what really was the starting point for our commission. So don't think that we started with the desire to spend more money. We started with the desire to both use money more effectively and to reform education systems and to learn from those that were working well. So we looked at the top performing 25% of education administrations around the world. And we worked out that if the poorer performers could get to the level of the top 25%, learn from what works and what is successful, teacher quality, leadership of schools, curriculum development, the use of technology, and so on, then we could actually achieve the sustainable development goals, or we're on the road to do so if we could find the extra money. But we must not say it's a choice between money and reform. I mean, you need money to reform, And of course, if you just have money and no reform, then you're going to waste huge resources. We've got to do both together. But don't forget that the average aid level for education in the lower and middle income countries of the world is $8 per child per head. Barely enough to pay for a second-hand textbook, far less to pay for the education that we need in teachers and in the organization and the building of schools. So we will need more than that $8 per head if we're going to incentivize people to take the reforms that are necessary. And what we are really proposing is a compact between the developing countries, as President Kikwete described, between the international community and the developing countries. In return from them investing more and reforming their education systems, we, the international community, must be prepared to do more. GPE is putting in huge amounts of money in grant financing for low-income countries. The IFFEd facility is simply a finance facility to raise money for lower middle-income countries who cannot get money at the terms that are necessary for education. But it is a compact for reform. But the compact needs reform, but it also needs us to invest. And we should, I'm afraid to say, be absolutely ashamed of the neglect of education over recent years. It was $10 per head a few years ago. It is now $8 and falling. If we don't do anything about it, you can forget about talking about sustainable development goals being achieved in a century, far less by 2030. We've got to be honest with ourselves that we need reform and investment at the same time.
Excellent. Okay, Tony just wants to say one
Historical note, the Americans lived under colonial tyranny longer than the people that to go back and look. That's all.
But
Just saying.
it's not
I'm
a
just saying.
contest.
I'm just
Not a
saying.
contest. Okay. So
We may not have suffered more, but we...
What I don't understand is whenever I come to America, the British monarchy is so popular,
Yes.
and yet you kicked them out in the 1770s.
the wounds healed after a while.
Yes. There's some nostalgia. Okay, we'll turn to the audience now. We'll take three
Oh yes,
questions.
education, that's right.
Yes. 3 questions. Please say your name and the organization that you're coming from. Okay, back here.
Good afternoon. Jordan Caslow from the Alliance. We're a coalition of private sector, public sector, and NGO partners that work to broaden the availability of eyeglasses worldwide so people can see to learn and earn. Research has shown that a pair of glasses had more positive impact on academic performance than any other health intervention ever studied. 10 times more than deworming the gut, 3 times more than nutritional supplementation. My question is, how can we, our membership, help everyone on the panel ensure that children around the world can see to learn? It's a very cost-effective way to improve learning.
Excellent. Okay, one cost-effective intervention suggestion right here in the middle. And then over here.
Hi, Mick Sheldrick from Global Citizen. Thanks everyone, and thanks Julia for the shout out. We definitely support GPE and support you all. I guess my question is specifically around the IFFEd. It's a huge endeavor, and if it works, it will be tremendous. But many of us have advocates. We have our 10 million members ready to go on this. But what is really the roadmap for scaling that up? Where should we direct that attention? Is it at governments? Is it at institutions, corporates? Like, what is the roadmap that we can support and rally behind to get that launched?
Okay, great question. And a last question here, and then we'll come back to you in a second.
Hi, my name is Katie, and I work with an NGO called More Than Me in Liberia. And I just had, I'm wondering from anybody from the panel, just if you had any advice to give to the Minister of Education in Liberia. Many of you may be familiar with what's going on there, with whether or not he should expand, what your thoughts are in expanding his pilot project of public-private partnership, just your thoughts on that.
You should ask the guy sitting next to you from CGD. Okay, but back to the panel. So, President Kikwete, do you want to say something about how you think about cost-effective interventions for education? Eyeglasses was mentioned. I'm sure there are others. How does Tanzania consider cost-effectiveness or evidence in deciding what will be funded in the education system?
Of course, for glasses, if they can be available for those who need, that would be wonderful. When I was president, One of the things that bothered me a lot was delivery, government delivery. How would the government deliver effectively on the programs that we are undertaking? Of course, I visited Malaysia. I saw how their programs, and then I asked the Prime Minister if they could also share that with us. I think Prime Minister Blair also had a similar program. We learned from both, and then we came up with what we call big results now. We looked at 6 sectors. First, of course, we had to decide on that at Cabinet. We should be among the 6 sectors. So we had a way of secret voting. So we said, okay, fine. Which one should be the first sector? So every minister votes. I'm sure every minister voted for his sector. And then which one is second? Which one is third, fourth, fifth, and sixth? And then we did a summation. And of course, education was one of the sectors that came top. Water, agriculture, transportation, government resources, and energy. Health came number 7.
No.
But because we had agreed on 6, then we said we should take 6. But later, of course, I used my executive powers to include health. to include health. Of course, what we really did was what we call the lab concept. We bring all the stakeholders under one roof. School owners, civil society organizations working on education, the donors, whoever in the public is interested in education comes there. What we do is discuss the state of education in the country. Identify areas of strength, identify areas of weaknesses, and then we agree on what should we do. So there's somebody there on a blackboard. People say, number 1 is this one. There's discussion until we agree that this is what should be done, how to do it. And then at the end of the day, we do costing. How much would that cost, which each will cost. So that's how we did it. And I can say in education is one of the things that it really helped us. Because what 4 years, the second year into my second term of office, we had bad performance in primary school, both in primary school and secondary school results. So this methodology really helped us. When in primary school we had 34%, and in secondary school we had slightly about close to 50%. But since last year, we go to 70% in both primary and secondary school. Thanks to this intervention, and the aim really is going, I think probably by this year they should get to 80%. So you can see, because we have really identified this and this and this, we target. Of course, there are some of the things is, let us recognize the best performer. So that school is announced, the top 10. Even the children by name, the first top 10. So now schools are really competing to be next year and they got a presidential award for that. So to be among the top 10, you get a presidential award. To be among the top 10 children, you get presidential. And we did for every subject, apart from schools. And then we identified the best performing teachers. Right. Best performing teachers. So in a way, it created a kind of a momentum and an incentive for schools to compete, but compete positively.
Great example.
Yes.
Thank you. And Julie, do you want to talk a little bit about the innovation and evidence window of the GPE?
Yes, I would. And I'd just Sometimes in these education discussions, I think we talk ourselves down and we talk ourselves into problems that we're actually uplifting from our own domestic education policy conversations and sort of putting down elsewhere. I think we have to be a little bit careful about that. Yes, I know from, reforming education in Australia, there can be a lot of rigidities and a lot of politics around education reform. But I actually find when I talk to many of our developing country partners in GPE that they're hungry for reform and to be doing it as efficiently as possibly, and they don't want to necessarily replicate every error we've ever made and then have to get their way out of it. They want to leapfrog so that the education system that they're creating is one that's sort of fit for purpose rather than sort of painstakingly go through every bit of development that Australia went through or the US went through. What is often lacking is making sure that there is good, reliable information, knowledge, evidence. It's not the same as health, where you can say, a treatment, this is how you deal with a heart attack in these circumstances. This is what the chemical formula for a vaccine is. It's a bit, more diffuse than that, but that doesn't mean that there can't be good ways of uplifting knowledge and exchanging it that enables people to reform and leapfrog, and that's what our knowledge and information exchange is about. I also think we talk ourselves down on the domestic resource mobilisation conversation. Yes, it's hard, but we shouldn't be saying there are domestic resources here and international assistance there. These two things are connected. In the GPE model, they're fundamentally connected, so that you qualify for one of GPE's big grants if you are increasing domestic resources. And because we've created that nexus, we can show in GPE countries that domestic resources have increased at 3 times the rate of increase on average. So you can turbocharge domestic resource mobilisation by having an effective model for change that brings in international resources. And often ministers for education say to us a good thing about that kind of model is it strengthens their hand in conversation with finance ministers to say, look, we can get this GPE grant if we do X on our side. It changes the nature of the conversation around the cabinet table. So that's a very important change too. I'd just say on things like the spectacles and other, do you expect me to want to comment on that? In terms of the inclusion agenda, I mean, we've very focused on the poorest and most marginalised. We've been very focused on girls, understandably. I think people are increasingly focused on children with disabilities and what is preventing them learning, and it can be something as simple as a pair of spectacles. And the better we get at that, the more serious we get about the early childhood education and development agenda, and Tony's been doing so much leadership there. And in GPE, we focused on pre-primary and some new programs there. The earlier we can, get to grips with whether an individual child needs some form of assistance, the less learning period's going to be lost. So I just want to endorse the work that you're doing, and I think it can be mobilised into the sort of sector planning that we're very focused on and want to get right at scale for the vast majority of children across these low-income and lower-middle-income countries.
Let me just add to that on spectacles. I mean, there are 35 million blind or visually impaired people around the world, and we should be supporting your campaign vigorously because it is a very cost-effective way of giving people access to knowledge, but also to the benefits of life. But new technology also offers us a huge opportunity because if you go into Apple, you can go into accessibility, you can turn print into audio almost instantly, and you can liberate people who are blind. They could be sitting in the same classroom as someone who is perfectly sighted, who is reading a book, and they can be getting this book in audio as a result of the ability now through new technology to transfer text into audio and to, for example, put this phone up and you can see who you can be told who you are, who's in front of you. You can show what labels are like. Braille is almost at a point at which it is being overtaken by these new technologies, and the problem here is access. And we should have the technology companies being prepared to share this technology and make it accessible free of charge to blind people in every part of the world. There is a potential revolution through new technology that can liberate people who are visually impaired from the handicaps that they have faced and give them access through this new technology, not just to learning, but to everything else. I just want to answer finally that question about donors from one of the great charities who are pressing you to do things round the world. It is donors we have got to get to in this because there are countries at the moment who could be doing far more and do far more effectively, and we cannot let this argument that aid is always ineffective and aid is always useless grow and allow people then to cut their aid budget. So we need to get to donors. The second thing is we need to persuade people that cooperation in development and the GPEs and the Education Cannot Wait is about multilateral cooperation. At the moment, only a third of education aid is going multilaterally. 2/3 of health aid goes multilaterally, particularly because of the Global Health Fund and Gavi, but only a third is going multilaterally. And that means, as President Kikwete will acknowledge, that you can have 20 countries giving very small amounts of money that are simply not enough to make a difference, when if they pooled their resources together on a multilateral basis, we can do more. And the final thing is, of course, about effectiveness of aid. I mean, I have been in Lebanon recently, where is a double shift school system operating so that refugees can get education by using the same classroom twice, once for the Lebanese pupils and then later in the day for the Syrian refugees. And kids are being educated at only $600 per year. Now, if that kid migrates to Germany, the cost of educating that child in Germany is $6,000 a year. And so we should have been more long-sighted about helping parents be able to stay in the vicinity of Syria and in other crisis areas by funding the education of their children so they do not feel that they have to leave for that to be the only chance for their child. So we can use our aid budgets more effectively and we can get more resources, particularly for refugees and displaced people, if we're imaginative in the way we harness these resources to the problems that have got to be solved.
Do you have any outlook for how UK's IFFEd is looking at investment in this area?
Yeah, I'm not following every single moment of British politics, which seems to change by the minute at the moment. So what I do say is that all of us have a duty. We recognise that the issue is about cost effectiveness. But when I tell you and remind you that only $10 per head is given in aid on average to a child in the lower and middle income countries, we've also got to prevent this cascade. If you ask someone in the publics of the West how much money was being given in aid to education, they'd probably think it was hundreds of dollars per head per child, because they've been told that aid is there and it's wasted and it's useless. We have got to make the case that for $10 per head we're doing a huge amount, but we could do even more with both the reform and investment together. We have a duty to educate the public about just how little aid there is and how effective it can be if we use it effectively.
Okay, great. We have a couple minutes left. I want to go to the front row. Toby Warren.
Could I simply ask
While you're
if on the eyeglasses, my UNICEF colleagues are back there. If you could get in touch with them afterwards, we can talk about it in a practical way. Okay.
over here in the front. Thank you.
I'm Katja Iversen from the organization Women Deliver, and just as the name implies, I will ask a gender question. Women deliver and so much more than babies. So looking at education, we come from a background of health, and as we say, if you only treat health as health, you're never going to solve the issues. But it's also, if you only treat education as education, you're not going to solve the issues. So looking at it with an integration lens, we have the WASH. Why is it that girls leave school, secondary school? Well, menstruating, you leave. Why is it that they leave child marriage? Why is it, kind of the economic empowerment, the health, those arguments? Would you put a gender lens to education also to be more efficient in the financing?
Okay, thank you. Is Tove Wang here from Save the Children Norway? Here? No? No. Okay, sorry. Thank you. Welcome.
Thank you. I think we all know the scale of the problem. We all know what we have promised. And if we don't get real serious about this, SDG 4 will be an empty promise, and we don't want to see that, right? So the Education Can't Wait, and the GPE, and the IFF, which could have been increased financing, actually the I, We strongly support all three of them and think they can not just work in harmony, but they can actually work in synergy if we are clever about it. 2 points. Domestic financing has been mentioned. And obviously it's important. I think we have to get there, we have to learn to like to talk about tax. It's hard, but it can be done. My second point has been mentioned by many. How do we measure our success by really reaching the worst off? I have this growing impatience for the child, and I get emotional about it. Living in a hut or a shack or a tent, often with illiterate parents, no book to be seen, no written material in their surroundings. These are the children we really, really have to focus on, and we have to start early. We can't wait to school age to make it happen. So early intervention for the worst off is what we really should focus on. And I challenge you all to follow that. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, and one last question, Barbara.
Thanks. I'm Barbara Bruns from the Center for Global Development and previously the World Bank. Every 3 years, the OECD's PISA results come out, and it inevitably launches a kind of veritable industry of countries wanting to go visit the countries that have made the most progress and understand what they've done, and education researchers doing work on what's driving improvements in this country, learning improvements in this country and not in others. So as you know, nothing like the PISA, which is developed for the OECD countries, now exists for that's relevant to low and middle income countries' needs. So, but do the thought experiment if there were something like that, and every 3 years GPE could say, well, look, the countries that have received GPE compacts over these 3 years have made 10 or 15 points more progress in learning than countries without it. I think, honestly, your replenishment donors would open their checkbooks, very easily, because we just are unable to deliver the metrics that really prove that we are creating the results that we want the financing to achieve.
Okay, thanks a lot.
So
okay,
the question is,
No.
what's stopping the donor community from making that a priority and saying we have to get some money together and build this kind of instrument and subsidize countries' participation in it, because we will all gain from knowing this data.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's have your final comments. We'll start with you, Tony, because
Can
you
I just
didn't get a
start
chance.
with Women Deliver, which is
Okay.
a tremendous organization.
Yes.
You've got it. You were looking down. Yeah.
I was.
I just said something wonderful
I
about
voted
women.
aye. My
Good.
ears just grew.
And I meant it. It brings to mind, your point was we have to look at all of this across sectors in an integrated way. And certainly I was yesterday and now I'm going to a meeting on sanitation and water, et cetera. And one of the main arguments is to get girls' facilities into schools, or the girls aren't going to come to school, with the ripple effect back and forth about gender and everything else. And my plea would be that we shouldn't hesitate to be talking about the importance of other sectors when we're raising money for each of our sectors, in whatever it is, education or any other, because they do absolutely fit together and certainly serve gender in so many different respects.
Okay, great, thank you. Julia, do you want to say something about testing and some of the points raised by...
Just quickly on both. On the gender perspective, absolutely, and it drives how we do our education planning. We've had a huge focus on girls. We can point to increases in primary school completion rates from 56% to more than 70%. Not enough, but the direction of travel is going in the right direction. And now, of course, secondary school under the SDGs is the next big horizon. And I think in all of that, looking at the whole girl, we can then see huge dividends across what it's going to mean for the economy, what it's ultimately going to mean for healthcare expenditure, because we can only stop the HIV/AIDS epidemic by educating adolescent girls, what it's going to mean in terms of the number of children, whether those children are healthy, whether they're vaccinated. So that gender perspective is in our work. What it means in terms of washrooms, clean water, conditional cash transfers, small transfers can make a very big difference to whether or not families send girls to school and the like. So absolutely agree with you. On the assessment piece, I agree with you on that too, which is why if you can, please advocate to any donors who are interested that they put money into our Assessment for Learning program, which is under our Knowledge and Innovation Exchange. Its aim is to assist developing countries to have diagnostic assessments and data strategies, and to look at the regional assessment strategies that are out there, because there are multi-country assessment strategies out there, to look at those and to work out how you can get the comparative line of sight between different regional assessment strategies. So we do need more and more information on what's happening with learning, and that Assessment for Learning program in our Knowledge and Information Exchange is how we're really forensically putting a light on that. And I think that there are some pleasing things happening, but off a low base and a long way to go. But countries are working on it, and we need to be working with them, and that's what that program's for.
Terrific. President Kikwete? Last.
First, one thing that I would really say and appeal to everybody. The problem I've seen with education is that, because when you look at the statistics, money for education has been declining, but money for health has been on the increase, money for infrastructure has been on the increase, which is a good thing. We are not saying reduce money for health and the infrastructure, but we will simply say look at ways of increasing money for education as well. But the disadvantage that we have with education is its problems are not visible. It's not like health. Yeah. Because when people are sick with HIV/AIDS, you see them, they die. But with education, they are not visible in this, unless you sit down in a commission like we did. That's when you realize that. So the whole in sub-Saharan Africa, only 20% of the kids can get secondary school education. Only 5% of young people can get tertiary education. So we are still talking of a continent that is essentially a continent of primary school leavers, and primary school education is literacy education. If the continent has to develop, definitely we have got to go above primary school. So that's why at times talking about education becomes a bit difficult to make people feel the urgency of investing, because people die of lack of education, but people visibly don't see it. So with gender, this thing has been discussed in greater depth in the work of the Commission, because the Commission worked with 30 research partners in 15 countries. So there is a wealth of information that led to the conclusions that the commission made. And gender became one of the issues that became. That's why we talk about, among the 4 transformations, one is inclusiveness. Inclusiveness, because one of the factors we said in sub-Saharan Africa or in African countries, the girl child is disadvantaged. Look at those sections of children who are disadvantaged. And the girl child is disadvantaged because social, cultural. In Chad, by the age of 15, most of the girls are married. When I visited Chad, I spoke to the president. He says, I know, it's a problem. He had to make a decree that girls cannot be married before the age of 18. Mm-hmm. And he's fighting it because there is a lot of resistance to it. So there are social, cultural encumbrances. So we also discussed the issue of school infrastructure. It has got to be friendly to girls. If it's not friendly to girls, they simply cannot go to school, because when there is need, there is no water, there is no sanitation proper for them. So these are factors that have been seriously taken on board in the discussions and the recommendations of the Commission.
Excellent, thank you. And all of you are commissioners of the Education Commission, so it's fitting that you'll have the last word.
Let me thank my fellow panelists, because they've answered most of these difficult and important questions. But let me thank you as an audience for your interest and continuing support for action on education. On the issue of assessment, we looked at this as a commission, and I may say Norway has been the leading country in promoting the work that we are doing, and I thank them for doing so. We have looked at the PISA for development, and I've talked to the OECD recently about this. Nancy Birdsall, who's not here today, of course, but does an important work, has got a proposal for a test for a 9-year-old in developing countries. All this, I think, has got to be looked at, because you're absolutely right. We must show that there is evidence of performance working and evidence of results and outcomes if we're going to persuade people of the case to do more. On girls' education, what I would add is the relationship between education and health, and we've got to improve the common working, particularly in the preschool years, where both are so important to the development of a child. But when you see these figures, infant mortality is twice as high amongst uneducated girls as educated girls in Africa. When the number of children born to educated mothers in the sub-Saharan Africa is 2, but for uneducated mothers is 5, and therefore you've got this vicious circle of uneducated girls, high birth rates, low national incomes per head, forced migration. You've got a pattern for decline that we must break by actions such as you are taking as a charity and want to recommend. And I think that goes to the point that Tove made about Save the Children Norway, who do a fantastic job on education. I just want to say that the idea behind the Commission was what we called progressive universalism, that we must have universal provision for everyone, but we must help those whose needs are the greatest, including girls, including street children, including people in rural areas, including the point that Tony emphasized at the beginning, the unequal chances for poorest people in the poorest communities of the world, and how little we have managed to do about that when it comes to aid. So underlying what we are doing is this principle of progressive universalism. Again, I don't expect President Trump to tweet in support of that principle at this stage, but I hope over time we can persuade people. And when it comes to my final remark, the G7 is going to be discussing education in a few weeks in Italy, and Julia has got proposals for them from the GPE, and I hope people can support the G7 taking action there. On the G20 agenda in July, on July the 9th in Germany, we hope to have endorsement of the International Finance Facility by the international community. Now, when countries come together and cooperate together, you can see that progress can be made, as happened on debt relief, on the Global Fund for Health, on many other issues in the last few years like climate change. Please use, if you can, your efforts to persuade the G7 and the G20, as well as individual donors, to make this difference. This is the year when we must focus on education because of the results we've seen, the challenge we now know needs to be met, and the threat to aid. And I hope that all of you can join us in promoting this agenda, which is an agenda for investment and reform taken together. Thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Jordan. We'll go out first. So that Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, sir.
Sorry about that.